Hello, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to make this gorgeous filet crochet top. I'm trying to hold it up to the white so you can see the pattern, but you'll see it anyway. I have made this so it's adjustable to any size. Basically in my ebook I've got the exact pattern that I used, including my extra columns for my width, just so you can get a vibe for it. And then I've got just the exact measurements of the flower pattern so you can add on your columns to your width. And then I've also got just one flower so that if the 2 flowers is too wide for you, you can just do the 1 and adjust it to your width as well. So I just wanted to make it so that you can make this top any size, and it is just as easy as adding on some more columns if you do need more width, taking off some if you want it smaller, or as I said, just doing the 1 flower if you need it a lot narrower. What I usually do to determine my size, as you'll see in this video, is I do a chain, and I actually do my first row as well, just to check. And because I've made a few of these now, I do know roughly how big to make it. But if you want to be sure, or this is your first ever filet crochet project, then I would recommend doing a little test gauge swatch, because you don't want to put loads of work into doing a few rows and then being like, this is massive or this is tiny. So I go over all of that in the ebook, but for this tutorial I just wanted to keep it mainly like how to do it. And then just one more thing before I start this tutorial, I did just want to give credit to Isabella, because I feel like she really kickstarted my obsession with filet crochet. I know it's not a new thing and that filet crochet has been around for a while, but her videos just kept on coming up on my TikTok, on my Instagram, and I feel like she just really helped to popularize it again. So I just wanted to give her a little mention. Okay, and now I'll get into the tutorial. So for my filet crochet projects, I like to use quite a thin cotton yarn. This one's just from Hobbii. It's the Friends Cotton 8-4 dark magenta yarn. I bought 4 balls. I actually only used 2.5, I would say. So 3 to 4 balls is a safe bet. And if you like doing scrap yarn projects, you've got a bit left over for this. I used a 2.5mm hook for this project. I wouldn't go bigger than this. You could go for a 2 or maybe a 1.5 or 1.75, but I would say 2.5 is probably the largest you'd want to go, because if you go any bigger, the design isn't as clear. So just to make it a little bit clearer, I've got this little section of a grid pattern, and I'm going to talk you through it right to left, just so that you fully understand what each grid square means. So for this section, it's a double crochet, chain, double crochet, chain, double crochet, 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 chain, double crochet. Feel like I've said double crochet so many times it doesn't even feel like a word anymore, but that's how we kind of read the grid pattern. So you'll definitely get used to this, but the first time you do it can be a little bit confusing. But the easiest way to look at it is that every white square is a double crochet, a chain, and a double crochet. That's in its complete form, and just thinking of it as a square on its own and not considering the squares it's next to. And then in the same way, if you're thinking about the square on its own, a filled in square is 3 double crochets. So as you'll now notice, every single grid square actually equals 2 stitches. So we have to bear this in mind when starting our project. So the grid pattern that I made for my sizing ended up being 80 columns long, which means my starting chain needs to be 160. This doesn't count the turning chains at the end. When I add my turning chains, it ends up being, I think, 162, because I do a turning chain of 3, but the first chain counts as a stitch. So I think if I've calculated that right, I end up doing 162 to give me an actual count of 160. So yeah, just remember, however many columns you have in your grid, you'll actually end up needing to double it when you're making your project. So once you've done your initial starting chain, we're then going to do a row of double crochet. I like to just have this as a bit of a border. You don't have to do this, you can just start working your grid straight away, but I always feel that it looks a bit cleaner having this row of double crochet along the bottom. So to do a double crochet, and you'll definitely need to know this as this whole project is basically built of double crochets, you basically yarn over, push through your chain, pull some yarn back, yarn over, pull through 2 loops, yarn over, pull through the last 2 loops. So again, that's yarn over, push through your chain, pull back some yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2. And you'll want to do this the entire way along your starting chain. So this is my row of 160 double crochets. I like to take this opportunity just to make sure it's fitting me how I want it to fit, because the last thing you want to do is do loads of work and then it's too baggy or too small. So it's always good to check it's fitting roughly right. So I wanted this to wrap around my sides a little, but not touch at the back. So once we've done our first row of double crochet, we need to do our turning chain. Now when I do double crochets, I like a turning chain of 2, but you might like to do 3 instead. It's really personal preference. But what we need to consider when we're doing this turning chain is the type of stitch that's first on the next row. So for me, this is a blank square. So I actually need to do a turning chain of 3 because I need to do my double crochet length and then a chain for the blank space. And this process is going to be the same at the end of each row. So once I have my 3 turning chains, I can then go ahead and do a double crochet. And we actually want to do this double crochet into the 3rd stitch along. So out of the 1st stitch, we have our turning chain. We then want to skip a stitch for our blank space. So then we want to be doing our double crochet into the 3rd stitch along. We then want to do 1 chain and 1 double crochet and repeat this process until we come to our first filled in square on our grid. For this first line, you do need to count your squares because you want to make sure you're starting in the right position. But you don't need to count every single stitch. Just do your chain and double crochet and then count the squares until you get to the square number of your filled in square. So for me, my first filled in square was number 26. So I wanted to make sure I counted 25 blank squares or 25 gappy double crochet squares until I then did my filled in square. So here I've reached where I need to do my first filled in square. It's also worth noting that on this first row, I started from this direction, but you can start from whatever direction you want, just make sure you're counting the right way. So to do my filled in square, we then want to do 2 more double crochets. So it'll end up looking like 3 double crochets because it takes into account the squares around it. It is also important to remember that when you have just 1 filled in square on your row, it definitely does need to be 3 double crochets wide, because if you think about the next row up, if this were to have a gappy stitch on top, we need to be able to do a double crochet, a chain and another double crochet and it to all fit in that gap. So you need the 3 stitches below it, if that makes sense. And then because this is the only filled in square on the row, we're then just going to continue doing our chain and double crochets for the rest of the blank squares of the row. So just to show you what this looks like compared to the pattern, as I said, I've been working from left to right of the pattern, but when you crochet, you work right to left, so I'll just swap this for ease. We just have 1 filled in square on this row. It ended up being number 26 for me, so I wanted 25 blank squares, then to do my 3 double crochets as my filled in square, and then the rest blank squares. So once we reach the end of the row, we're going to turn our work again with 3 chains up and flipping our work. Remember that when we're working on the next row, we then need to work from the other side of the grid. So I just worked from left to right, and now I'm going to be working from right to left because we're flipping our work at the end of each row. And then we're just going to do our chain and double crochet to make our blank squares until we reach our filled in squares again. Like on the first row, you can just count to where you need to do the filled in square. But as I said, I sometimes like to just base it on where the filled in squares were on the row before. So for this row, I know that there's only 2 filled in squares. One of them stacks on top of the last filled in square and the other one is next to. So I know that I can just crochet my gappy squares up until that point, and then I'll need to do my filled in square on top of the stitch and next to. And because I flipped my work, I need to make sure that I do the filled in square that's next to the one that's stacked on top on the right side. You'll also see that when you do 2 filled in squares next to each other, it ends up only being 5 stitches long. And the easiest way to look at this is that they share a middle stitch with each other. So individually, if you were to look at them as squares, they do each have 3 stitches, but they share their middle stitch with each other. And then we basically need to just repeat this process row after row, doing our chains and double crochets for blank squares and multiple double crochets for filled in squares. One of the most important things to remember is that we flip our work at the end of each row, so we do just need to make sure we're working from the right side of the grid each time. If you're putting down your project and picking it back up at different times, maybe just make a note on your grid where you left off and what direction you were going. I also like to cross off my filled in squares as I go, just so I can keep track of where I am. Here's another example of how the crochet piece looks in comparison to the grid. So if you want to pause this and count the squares and make sure you're understanding, go ahead and do it. But I just thought it was helpful to see this in comparison to how the actual grid looks. So once you've worked up a few rows, you can see that there's more double crochets and like filled in squares coming into play. When I'm doing lots of these in a row, I like to count them and just check them against the pattern, because I do find myself often working off of the row before, but I don't want to go wrong to my pattern. So when I'm counting for my filled in squares, I like to count 2 stitches for each filled in square on the grid, and then 1 extra because I know this is shared with a blank square. So I'll just leave you to watch now, and I'll leave it running so that you get a really good feel for it. And I'll also insert these little comparisons so you can see how the actual crochet compares to the grid itself. So once you've finished your grid, it should look something like this. I decided to do a few extra rows of blank squares above where my flowers finished, but this is totally optional. You could just finish the panel where the flowers finish, but I decided to add a little bit more separation between the panel and the breast piece. To then finish off the panel, I wanted to do a row of just solid double crochet. So I chained up a couple of times, turned my work, and then it did a row of double crochet. For the first stitch of the row, you're double crocheting into the blank space, and then for the next stitch you're double crocheting into the top of the stitch, and then you're just repeating this all the way across the row. Also, it's worth noting you don't have to do this row of double crochet. I like to do it because it mirrors the bottom of the panel, but you don't have to do it at all. Once you've reached the end of that row, or if you haven't bothered doing this row, this will be what you do at the end of whatever your final row is. You want to secure your yarn, so I do this by chaining twice, cutting the yarn and pulling it through to form a knot. So next we need to work out where we're going to do our breast panel. This is totally optional, you can finish this top a different way, but I just find this is quite a timeless look and a great way of adding more coverage. So I simply just hold the panel up to me. I like to give it a bit of a stretch because when we tie it up at the back, it will be pulled around the body, so it will be in a kind of stretched position. So I like to just give it a little stretch and then work out where I want it to reach on each side. I then just put a couple of stitch markers here, and then I do check that each side matches up. So for me, my stitch markers ended up being 36 stitches away from each end. So we now need to attach yarn back onto our work, and we want to make sure we're doing this on the right side of the panel. So you want to make sure your stitches are facing towards you and that you're not working into the back of the stitches. To attach our yarn back onto the work, we're just going to do a single crochet. So we're going to find the stitch where we're attaching our yarn back on, we're going to push through it, pull some yarn back, yarn over, and pull that through the 2 loops on the hook. We're then going to continue doing that all the way across the line because we're doing a line of single crochet. You could do a different stitch here, but I just find that single crochet gives the most coverage. Once we've single crocheted all the way along that row and reached the next stitch marker, we need to do our final single crochet, chain up once, and then turn our work. We're then just going to repeat this process for as many rows as we need for our chest piece. You could do some increases and decreases to add some more shaping here, but I prefer to just do a flat panel and then I end up doing some decreases at the top so that it's not gaping. But if you want to do some increases and decreases as you go, you totally can. If you run out of yarn at any point during your project, I find the best way to attach more yarn on is to do a magic knot, and it's probably best to just watch me do this. In its simplest form, you're basically taking one of your pieces of yarn and tying a knot around the other piece of yarn, and then doing the same with the other piece of yarn around the original piece of yarn. Again, watching it will probably make more sense than me describing it, but you do this and then you pull them together and it really secures the knot. Once you've done your magic knot, you can just continue crocheting as normal. I did a total of 32 rows of single crochet, no increases, no decreases, just doing a row, turning the work, doing a row, turning the work. Once I'd reached 32 rows, I then decided I wanted to do another row of double crochet because I wanted it to match the bottom of the panel, the middle bit of the panel. Like, I just thought it was nice to kind of sandwich everything in with another row of double crochet. Again, optional, you don't have to do this, but I think it just looks nice. So yeah, to do this row of double crochet, you just want to chain up 2 or 3 times depending on how big your turning chains are, and then turn your work and do your row of double crochet along to the other side. Once you reach the other side, you just want to secure your yarn in the usual way of chaining up a couple of times, cutting the yarn and pulling it through to form a knot. So we're really moving on to optional details here. I find that this is a really nice way of doing the ties at the back. You can totally weave ties through the gappy stitches anyway, but I find it creates such a nice finished look if you create holes for the ties to actually go through. So we're going to be working on each side of the panel now. So we need to attach our yarn back onto our work by doing a single crochet, and then we're going to single crochet all the way up the panel. Because double crochet stitches are bigger than single crochets, I like to do 2 single crochet stitches into every double crochet stitch. So you should end up with double the amount of single crochets to how many rows you have. Once we've single crocheted all the way up the panel, we then want to do a chain and turn our work and single crochet all the way back down. Once we reach the end of that line of single crochet, we're then going to chain and turn our work again, but this row we're going to add in some holes. Where you position your holes is really dependent on how tall your panel is and also how many holes you do want. So for me, my row of single crochet was 72 stitches long, and then I decided I wanted about 4, 5, 6 holes. So what I did was 2 single crochets, 4 chains to create my hole, and then I skipped 4 stitches, single crocheted into the next stitch along, and then I wanted a total of 12 stitches between this hole and the next one. So then after my 12 stitches, I then did 4 more chains, skipped 4 more stitches, and then attached my yarn back on, 12 more hole, 12 more hole, 12 more hole, and then 2. So I wanted to make sure that I had a hole at the top and bottom of my panel, and then the rest were evenly spaced between. But you're just gonna have to do a bit of maths and kind of figure it out. And then once you figured out one side, you know that you can do the same on the other side. So one side will take a bit longer and take a bit more maths, but once you've got that measurement, you're good to go. So yeah, I just repeated that process all the way up that row. I chained at the top, turned my work, and then worked all the way back down the next row. Whenever I got to one of the holes, I just made sure to do 4 stitches into that hole, just to make sure that the stitch count didn't change. Once I got to the end of that row, I then chained and turned my work and did 1 more row of single crochet back up. The amount of single crochets you do here is totally optional. You may want a much thinner section, so you might just do a couple of rows of single crochet, but for me, I just wanted these holes to look really intentional, so I made them quite thick. And then as usual, after the last row of single crochet, we then just want to chain twice, cut the yarn, pull it through and secure a knot. We can then repeat this whole process on the other side of the panel. We're now going to create our straps, which also are the ties for the back. So I like to do this by first attaching my yarn back onto my project. I decided to attach it back onto the stitch where we started our chest piece. I attach it back on with a single crochet, and then I just single crochet all the way up the side of the chest piece. I only do 1 single crochet per row because we're doing single crochets into single crochet rows. They're pretty much the same size. When I get to the top of the row, I'm then gonna chain so many stitches. I haven't got an exact number because I chained so many that I didn't want to count, but these are gonna form your ties at the back. So I would chain as many as you can be bothered to do. I feel like whenever I create ties, I never do them long enough. So I would just chain loads, and then even when you think you've done enough, chain more. Once you have finally chained enough, we then need to single crochet back down this entire chain. It's tedious, but I feel like it does give a better look than just a chain. If you do want those really thin spaghetti straps, you can totally leave this as a chain and your straps are done. But I like to single crochet all the way back down it, and it doesn't actually take that long in the grand scheme of things. I feel like it's worth it for the final look. When you reach your chest piece, I like to really secure these straps in place by single crocheting down that row we just did. So technically, we've just done a really big long turning chain, and we just want to crochet all the way back down this row that we initially did. I then just want to slip stitch into that row at the bottom of the panel, and then I'm going to do what I usually do and chain twice, cut my yarn and pull it through to secure. I really like doing the straps this way because I feel like the rows of single crochet up the side of the chest pieces first of all keep the straps really secure to the piece, but also add some nice detail and some nice shaping. I do, however, want to add a little bit more shaping to the top because it is a little bit gapey. So the way that I do this is just attaching my yarn back on with a slip stitch. I actually do this into the first stitch of the straps, not into the row itself, just because I feel like this row creates a little bit of depth. We're then just going to do a decrease stitch for every stitch we're going into. So I'm pushing through 1 stitch, pulling some yarn back, pushing through the next, pulling some yarn back, yarning over and pulling through all of those loops on my hook. So I'm doing this for every single stitch in the row. Once you reach the other side of the row, I like to do a slip stitch into the first stitch on the strap again to match up with the other side. I then do 2 chains, cut my yarn and pull it through to secure a knot. And once you've weaved in all of your ends from throughout the project, the top is finally done.